Hi everyone, how are you? It's good to see you actually made it here. One of the biggest problems I have getting into London is actually getting into London because most of the trains that I tend to take are always delayed, which is always fun. But as we stand here basically talking about the future, I was walking around the hall outside, and it's interesting. The one thing that we all have in common is we are all interested in the future. Whether it's at a personal level, an organizational level, an investment level, for whatever reason, we are all interested in what's going to be happening tomorrow, over the next couple of years, and depending basically on your sort of point of view over the next couple of decades. So SGX, tomorrow's trends today. SocGen, future is you. API, this is a fun one, we'll talk about this later. Trusted and reliable data sets. Volatility, as Amelie mentioned, and I can shine a light on some of the volatility basically that's coming through. And then when we have a look at things like ESG, for example, there is this report basically mentions a whole variety of technological trends and bits and bobs. We're certainly going to be delving into that one a little bit more. And then link trade, the future of structured investments. So it's clear just by walking around outside that there is a lot of interest in the future. So my name's Matthew Griffin. I'm the CEO and founder of the 311 Institute. We're a London-based think tank, and we work typically between the dates of 2020 to 2070. The reason why we go beyond 2040 is because if you are working with the G7 governments or the G20 governments, from their perspective, they want to understand how do you build a country. If you're building a country, what things should you invest in? What is your societal structure going to look like in 2040, 2050? What type of welfare system should you have? Which industries are going to be the big industries? If you're KSA, basically you're the Middle East and you're investing $500 billion basically building out a city that's 10 times the size of New York, or you're building ports or heavy infrastructure assets, typically you want to understand a little bit more than 5 years out. So I go all the way from the near term, medium term, and all the way out. And as a consequence, I work with a whole variety of different companies, basically on a whole variety of different things. So I work with Airbus, basically on the future of transportation. Bentley's an interesting one. If anyone has a Bentley want to try to understand how people are going to be living beyond the age of 100. I guess because basically if you live beyond the age of 100, you can keep buying their cars, albeit as a service. I also sit on the Technology and Innovation Committee for Centrica. So at Centrica, we are selling a whole variety of energy generation assets and all sorts of bits and bobs, and we're looking to transform the company top down. I work with all the top auditing organizations, the UAE government. So if you go out to Dubai and you want to take a Mach 1 train basically from Dubai basically to Abu Dhabi, you want to get in a flying taxi, you want to just do something rather odd, Dubai is a fantastic place to be. I work with organizations like Huawei on the next 20 years of smartphones and devices, so all the things basically that are in our pockets and driving some of the things that we're going to be seeing today. Sky on the future of entertainment. GEMS on the future of education. Microsoft, basically the future of artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth. As I travel around the world, one of the things that I think a lot of people struggle with when they're trying to view the future is this. It's just the sheer complexity of it all. And you guys, basically, and gals, will know this more than anybody else. If we step back to kind of the 1980s, 1990s, and I say, right, from a technology perspective, what do you think you're going to be able to do next year that maybe you couldn't do this year? And you'll extrapolate stuff out, and you'll have a look maybe, for example, at Moore's Law and say, well, next year, I think the cost of computing will fall. The amount of computer performance that we have access to is going to increase, and so on and so forth. And if I said, well, what does that fundamentally mean for your business? You'd be able to plot it out and say, well, we should be able to ingest and analyze more information and do some stuff with the information, whatever that happens to be. Today, though, when asked the same question, you're not just being hit by one type of technological trend. You're being hit by multiples. Every single one of your organizations. On the one hand, we have some sort of basic technology. So, for example, everyone is talking to you about digitization and cloud. But at the same breath, they're talking to you about blockchain, artificial intelligence, robotics, and then depending on the industry that you're in, augmented reality, virtual reality, and all these other sort of things. Gene editing, for example. So all of a sudden, when I say to you, what do you think you'll be able to do next year that you couldn't do this year? all of a sudden, the number of options that you have available to you, before we even start digging into the business dynamics of go-to-markets and business models and everything else, is much, much greater. And all of this stuff is accelerating. So when we talk about technologies and exponential technologies, I think basically you should really be talking about exponential combinations of technologies, and we'll come through to what that means in a bit. Now, how many of you have seen this chart? This is an exponential technology curve. It's generally available all over the place. One of the interesting things when we're trying to predict the future is, according to Ray Kurzweil, this particular chart basically is a chart of computer performance per $1,000. If you have a look on the left-hand side of it, we start getting to the point where we have enough computing power in a standard silicon chip to model an insect brain. He then predicts that we then have enough computing power to model a mouse brain, and then in a couple of years after that, enough for a human brain. Now, this particular chart was based on silicon, so x86 computer silicon, everything that you have in your smartphones, your servers, all that kind of stuff. About 3 weeks ago, we actually hit one mouse brain. So we now have a computer that can model a mouse brain. But the biggest surprise is it's not a silicon-based computer. It is a neuromorphic computer. Technology throws you curveballs. In addition to that, when we have a look at all these different technologies, what you have is you have increasingly powerful technologies that are becoming increasingly democratized. In addition to that, we have an increasingly connected society where, at the moment, we're throwing 4,500 satellites into space to connect the other 3.5 billion people on the planet. If all these people suddenly have access to powerful technology, they can create new things. All you need is one Einstein, basically, out of the 3.5 billion people that aren't connected to the planet to change something up. So invariably, from a technology perspective, we see this. Technology always gets better, faster, and cheaper. Technology is absolutely fantastic at reducing the individual cost of brokerages and transactions and all these sorts of things down to zero. If you think about the cost of storage, you think about the cost of networking, the cost of compute, if you think about the cost of energy, the cost of labor, all these sorts of things, we are driving everything down to zero. But similarly, when we start looking at technology, we have something I call the technology nexus. Every single industry is connected to one another. Any changes that happen in one industry ultimately ripple across to every other industry. So, for example, when we have a look at advisory, if you go and have a conversation with companies like Allen & Overy, Linklaters, Eversheds, all these sorts of things, increasingly we're using artificial intelligence to create robo-lawyers. Those robo-lawyers are now being used by the likes of Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and everything else to trim about 80% of their legal about 80% of their legal work down. So a robo-lawyer can churn through contracts in seconds that it takes experienced human lawyers days or even weeks to go through with greater accuracy. Only just about greater accuracy, but greater accuracy for 99.9% less cost. When we have a look at things like agriculture, today we are collapsing agricultural supply chains. So, for example, China just bought $300 million of clean meat. Clean meat basically is meat, so it's fillet steak, it's duck, it's beef, it's all that kind of stuff. But it's grown in a bioreactor using stem cells. You don't have a cow, you don't have a chicken, you don't have a duck, you don't have a turkey. In addition to that, when we have a look at the agricultural space, there is a huge uptick basically in the number of vertical farms. If you want to grow 8 crops a year, but you want them to be organic, you want that produce to be cheaper than the stuff that you can buy on the shelves in the supermarkets, we're doing that. Jeff Bezos just invested $250 million in Plenty. Why? Because he can shove a vertical farm and a couple of bioreactors into an Amazon warehouse, and he disrupts the agricultural food and food production business and delivers fresh food to you on tap. Construction. Increasingly, we're 3D printing buildings, particularly out in the Middle East. We're also talking about fully autonomous construction sites. What does that do for regulations and governments, all that sort of stuff? Education. Education we'll come on to in a bit. Entertainment. Entertainment, we are automating the creation of entertainment. Finance, government's changing. Again, from a health perspective, when we talk about health, if I look like I'm taking a selfie, all I do is I use a $50 smartphone, and if I look like I'm taking a selfie, and you say, well, what are you doing? I say, well, I'm checking myself for pancreatic cancer. I'm checking myself for skin cancer. I'm talking into the phone, I'm checking myself for disease and dementia and all that sort of stuff. This is already a rudimentary tricorder. And all you're doing is you're using what I do now. I'm now checking myself for heart arrhythmia, likelihood of a heart attack. Because we're using the sensors in this phone, basically we are using a mix of accelerometers, cameras and machine vision, and artificial intelligence on these things to do new things. And from a health perspective, that starts decentralizing the multi-trillion-dollar healthcare industry. Manufacturing, 3D printing, additive printing, being able to 3D print things on demand. We can collapse supply chains. Adidas, Nike, Under Armour are doing that. You start changing the way that we manufacture products, all of a sudden you have a knock-on effect on transportation and logistics. Media, resources, retail, we have fully autonomous retailers coming through. JD.com, they turn over about $55 billion a year in China. Amazon have now laid the groundwork to become the world's first fully autonomous retailer. And we're not just talking about taking a product off a shelf, basically automatically fulfilling it and shipping it to somebody. We are talking about being able to automatically design the product, put it onto the website, then show it to people. People then buy it, it's then manufactured on demand in the back of stores. So at the moment, Amazon are going to be rolling this out by the looks of it in 2019. It's predominantly fabric-based. Space, we're starting to democratize space. The cost of launching stuff into space has fallen by 100-fold over the past 5-6 years with reusable launch rockets. What that means, all of a sudden, basically, is that from a communications perspective, you can launch communication satellites very, very cheaply into space. You can connect the other 3.5 billion people on the planet. You start sticking all of this stuff together. Utilities, we are driving the cost of energy down to zero. If you're a manufacturing company, that's probably quite interesting. So all of this stuff eventually ripples back round, and then that inevitably flows basically into your investments, basically, and how you view the world. But again, similarly, all of these trends basically have a couple of things in common. They are increasingly helping us democratize and decentralize every single industry on Earth. If you step back 100 years ago and you were sitting in the middle of a field, could you have done your banking? Could you have made phone calls? Could you have been buying stuff? Could you have been making reviews? Could you have been communicating? Could you have been assessing your health? No. Increasingly, all of these technologies are helping us democratize and decentralize everything. It's one of the major trends, including expertise. Google, for example, democratized access to information. If I ask you what the melting point of liquid hydrogen is, none of you know that now, but you go to your phone, in 2 seconds' time, you'll be able to tell me. Using artificial intelligence, we are starting to democratize access to expertise. That is a fundamental shift, basically, in how we all interact, basically, with things. How do we put together a particular type of contract? I'll tell you what, go online, basically, go and ask a robo-lawyer. Done. So everything is changing. But similarly, with the onset of all these different technologies, they're getting us to ask at a fundamental level, what does it mean for us to be humans? Because we are starting to get to the point, on the one hand, where technology that was near us is now kind of on us. Eventually, it'll start going in us. We already have smart pills, but that's a cultural change. However, from a professional perspective, particularly as we talk about the rise of automation, increasingly people around the world are saying, well, what can I do as an individual that technology can't? What's my place? What's my purpose? What's my function? How do I fit into this world of the future? And that's a tricky one. So how many of you believe in magic? See, no one. See, normally it's the magician. You can always spot the magician in the crowd. So just as a little demonstration just to demonstrate where we actually are with technology, because technology is a rocket ship. It's all the way over here. You think it's here. You think that our technological capabilities are here. Technology is a rocket ship. It's all the way over there, and then we have to figure out how to harness it, how to bring it in, how to turn it into products and services, how we regulate that, how we get that stuff into the marketplace. If you've ever sort of watched any science fiction film, they're always full of holograms. Loads and loads of holograms everywhere. And this is the world's first free-form, free-air hologram. And it's made using cellulose and lasers. So think of every single science fiction thing that you know, from tractor beams all the way through to deflector shields. We already have prototypes and we've already built the first concepts. So this is an early generation technology. Today this thing's this big, tomorrow it'll be that big, then it'll be that big, then eventually it'll start getting commercialized, and then culturally we'll say, well, we either like it or we don't, or what have you, basically, and then it gets into the product mix. If you step back 200 years ago, and I showed you a free-form hologram, you'd probably burn me at the stake. Similarly, if I just showed you a light, here's a light bulb, and by the way, it's powered. Similarly, you'd probably think I was a magician, and you'd probably burn me at the stake. So lots of burning at the stake, which fortunately we don't do, because otherwise I'd be in trouble. Again, so I just want to sort of show you these just to sort of get you thinking about this stuff. This one, so what if we could actually live stream images directly from your brain? This technology is improving, actually now leaps and bounds. Within this technology, we're combining artificial intelligence with a product called fMRI. And if you sort of have a look at the images, again, a lot of you sort of will probably look at these images and go, it's a bit grainy, it's a bit rubbish. That's this emerging technology stuff, rubbish. But you could probably tell what some of these images are. But don't let it be lost on you that what we're really doing here is we are taking live feeds in real time from billions of human neurons and synapses. And then we are recompiling it basically into something that you can stream to YouTube. The New York Police Department are now using some of these, the cousins basically of these products to do photo fits, because they say, well, just think of the person who mugged you. And those photo fits are turning out to be about 85% accurate. So all of a sudden, basically, the photo fit artist is rather worried basically that it's going to be made redundant. And it's stuck. Right. However, as we sort of continue down the road, the quality of these images has come on a huge amount in the past 3 to 4 years. In another 3 to 4 years, this is going to start looking like something that you could actually broadcast. So we talk about, in all the sort of pamphlets and leaflets and brochures basically in the other hall, basically we talk about technologies and all these sorts of things. So what I want you to do now is meet the what I call the exponentials. We all know about artificial intelligence and all these sorts of things, but ultimately if you want to figure out what the next generation industry is, what the next generation product or services are, there aren't just these kind of 5 or 10 technologies basically that people particularly talk about. There are hundreds. I track over 400. What I'm going to show you now basically is the technologies that are coming through in the next kind of 40 years. There are 12 major categories, 169 emerging technologies. Each one of these emerging technologies has an addressable market opportunity of at least $500 billion, and each one of them can transform an industry in their own right. But then we also have 25 general-purpose technologies. So, for example, a general-purpose technology is one like artificial intelligence, where you can use it cross-sector, it's pervasive, and it spawns innovation. There are 25 of those, not just kind of the 1 or 2 that we typically sort of talk about. But when we have I'll just sort of skip through these briefly, because it's probably boring. If we have a look at the advanced manufacturing sector, over here, for example, we have bioprinting. If you want to eliminate the UK's organ donation program, that does it right there. If you want to help people live another 10 to 20 years, does it right there. You can 3D print human organs. So heart tissue, bones, skin, whole variety of things, and we're doing that today. But again, it's got to get through the regulators and stuff. Holographic printing. We talk about 3D printing, and we say, well, today, one of the biggest problems with 3D printed goods basically is that 3D printers are really, really slow. A 3D holographic printer is 1,000 times faster. If you want to print a chair like these, basically, and you want to do it in about half a second, holographic printing is fantastic. That's already being rolled out. And then we have a sort of whole variety of other things. Bioreactors. With bioreactors, you can get rid of every single animal that we have on the planet that we eat. Don't really want to get rid of the other ones. Basically, there are a couple of governments basically trying to sort of get rid of the other ones. We have molecular assemblers that are coming through. So at the start of last year, we saw the world's first molecular assemblers. We had molecule-sized robots. We put them into a molecular-sized production line, and they created molecules. But similarly, When we start having a look at computing systems, we talk about moving from silicon to neuromorphic to quantum computer technologies. But increasingly, again, we have DNA and biological computers. Over in China, we've already got the 5th generation biological computer running. And that's where you can turn a bacteria or human cells into a compute and storage device that you can then play movies from. So when people say that we are starting to get to the point where we are topping out computer power, forget it. If you take a test tube full of a DNA computer, you can replace every single computing platform on the planet today. Liquid computing, that's a little bit further out, but again, we have liquid CPUs, liquid transistors, basically, that we've already created. As we sort of move around the wheel, basically we have 5G and 6G. So for example, 5G basically is a multi-purpose technology. 6G is due out in about 2030 from a commercial perspective. That's a multi-terabit network. We also have nuclear batteries. So for example, if you're in the medical field, one of the biggest problems that we have with pacemakers is the batteries run out after about 10 years. That solves the problem. In addition to that, we have wireless technologies, so wireless energy technologies. If you have a look at today's electric vehicles and you're all thinking, fantastic, race into lithium, race into commodities, race into anyone producing any form of lithium-ion battery, we're already producing wirelessly charged cars, and eventually we replace the batteries in those wirelessly charged cars in about 2030 with structural batteries. Structural batteries are where we use something called carbon nanotubes to turn chairs and any type of material into the battery. You can get rid of lithium-ion. So lithium-ion basically will still be around for a very long time, but we're already starting to see how we can kill it. And then on the intelligence side of things, we have AGI. Last year, Google created the first AGI. It was called Impala, and it managed to do 30 things at once, and they kept it very, very deep in the labs. Artificial narrow intelligence, that's what we use today, and that's what you guys basically all have in your platforms. Bots, cognitive computing, creative machines. So creative machines, that's it. Do you really think basically that the entrepreneurs that you're going to be up against in the future are going to be human? So we have something on that. Diffractive neural networks. A diffractive neural network is a 3D printed artificial intelligence. DNA neural networks. Similarly, a DNA neural network, we've managed to turn pieces of DNA into a complicated neural network. So don't just think that artificial intelligence is always going to be binary or even quantum-based. As we sort of go around the wheel, basically we've got all sorts of other bits and bobs. But we'll sort of move on. So from an AI perspective, and I want to show you something a little bit different here. So what we now have is the ability to create something called immortal avatars. Now, originally, basically, these look like sort of really great customer service agents. So we talk about robo-advisors and all that kind of stuff. But this is an avatar called Will. He's based out of Soul Machines, and as you can see, it's high definition. He actually has a neural network brain, and at the moment is being used across a variety of different industries. But we now have Fortune CEOs. If you think about all the data that's out there about you in the world, we now have Fortune CEOs who are now saying, I want a digital avatar of myself. And when they say, well, why? They say, well, because it allows me to live kind of technically forever. So we now have Fortune CEOs basically who are working basically with some of these startups to create digital avatars of themselves so when they die, their boards can still dial them up and say, well, by the way, we're going to be merging, and we're thinking about merging or buying this company. What do you think? And that avatar basically can say, based on my personal experience when I was alive, I didn't like that company. So again, when you're starting to have a look at your risk models, when you're evaluating the executive boards of companies, are you taking this into account? We've also got some more standard robo-advisors actually appearing on the boards, particularly out in Japan. Robo-regulators. Regulators, basically everybody always complains about the regulators. If technology is a rocket ship, then the regulator basically is the bloke on a bike, basically with a puncture, trying to sort of catch up, going, what am I doing? In the UK, the FCA are now starting to talk in terms of creating the world's first robo-regulator, so digitizing the rule books, basically using machine learning. And they're not the only ones. Japan is starting to tentatively sort of create robo-regulators. In the FCA's case, basically they're thinking of using robo-regulators to particularly sort of govern and police the fintech space. But again, there's a journey that we have to go through here, but these conversations are now happening at a government level. So Philip Hammond first started rolling this concept out a couple of years ago, and we have the technology to deliver it. But it's complicated. You know, it's the integration and putting this stuff together. This one's a fun one. So recently, the US government touted a particular project called Krynos. This is literally a global intelligence platform. If you all understand chaos theory, you know, what happens in one particular geography, you know, typically somehow affects something somewhere else. This is a massive multi-year effort, but essentially this is trying to track every single chaos, every single event, and then try to piece all of that together to try to understand basically, you know, what threats are emerging, what basically impacts do we have on the economy. And again, basically when we start having a look at these, what we call these global intelligence platforms, China has now created an AI policymaker. So when they go and sit down basically with people who are building out the Silk Roads, and they say, well, you know, we think that, you know, we could work together like this. The Chinese government, via their foreign ministry, are now being advised by an AI policymaker that simply trawls huge amounts of data and say, if this is your negotiating tactic with this particular government or country, it's less likely to work. Use this. So these things are already here. China is already using that. But again, the capability of these things increases exponentially over time. And similarly, we started talking about creative machines, and there's a reason why I'm showing you this.
What if you could come up with thousands of options for a single design without drawing, all of which meet specific goals set by the designer? And from those options, pick the one design that delivers on the most important criteria, the design you couldn't possibly have imagined. This is generative design, a technology that harnesses massive computing power, creating forms with precise amounts of material only where needed, achieving maximum performance while wasting nothing. But generative design can be about much more than simply turning out alternatives. Prototypes can be scanned and equipped with sensors that provide real-time performance data that can be looped back into the design process, so the object, in effect, co-designs itself. And depending on the material and method of manufacture chosen, the software can optimize the design for those choices. The things that have limited us in the past, software, materials, manufacturing, no longer do so. With generative design, the world can look and perform any way we want it to. This is the next stage in the evolution of design, and it's happening now.
So if you're wondering better why I showed you that, because you're not in the drone industry, I understand that. It's because what I'm fundamentally showing you basically is the development of creative artificial intelligence-fueled machines that can accelerate the rate of a company's innovation by 1,000 to 10,000-fold. That platform is already being used by Airbus, Under Armour, and a whole variety of other organizations. But again, it's at the start. At the moment, it works on hardware, so we're kind of here, iterative innovation, taking an existing product and improving it, taking intelligence from a product, basically, and then simply using that intelligence to design the next better product. These eventually go to primary, but when you start combining these, so remember I talked about exponential combinations, when you start combining all these different technologies at the bottom together, more compute, better AI, better materials, and 3D printing, you end up with this. So this is a little robot, basically it looks a little bit weird. This robot is tasked with moving from one side of the room to the other as quickly as possible. It's loaded with a bunch of sensors. As it's moving around its environment, it's taking information from those sensors and feeding that back into a creative artificial intelligence, this one, that is then iterating it, running thousands and thousands of simulations a second to try to create robot version number 2 that moves faster and all that sort of stuff. And when it comes across a particular design that it thinks is good, it shoves it off to a 3D printer. So the computer at the back is the one that houses the creative AI. You don't need huge amounts of infrastructure for this stuff. You can run it on your PC at home, if you still have one. You can run it on your smartphone. So that's the 3D printer. But similarly, and we did this a couple of years ago, if you replace that 3D printer with a 4D printer, you have a self-evolving robot that self-manufactures itself and then walks out of the printer. And then it can repeat the process. So while I'm showing you robots and cars and everything else, it's the underlying function that I want to get your head around. The fact basically that we are at the point of dramatically accelerating the rates of global innovation. What does that do to how you view the world? When you start in 3 or 4 years' time going, where did that thing come from? You know, that's quite an interesting design. These things are going to be at the forefront. And we're using these things already basically in science, chemical engineering, and all sorts of bits and bobs. But, and this is sort of why I showed you that as a little bit of a backdrop, increasingly, we have artificial intelligences that are self-replicating, self-coding, self-designing, self-evolving. So when we talk about hardware, we can talk about thousands of iterations a minute. When we're talking about software, we can talk about millions of iterations per second. Increasingly as well, basically, we are now at the point, in fact, we were at the point last year, where we have self-learning AIs, basically, that are creating their own knowledge. But the downsides of technology is this. So last year, from a social media perspective, we reached a point called the inversion, where there was more information generated on social media, for example, things like Twitter, by bots than by humans. So increasingly, we are approaching a point come kind of 2023, where ultimately, more of the decisions, more of the we're going to be putting more trust and more decision-making capability in the hands of machines. And then as we look around the world, when I sort of first started highlighting this a couple of years ago, there were kind of 1 or 2 organizations that were turning fully autonomous. But now there are more organizations that are turning fully autonomous. So if you're aware of Bridgewater Associates are currently using the ex-IBM Watson team to automate the entire company, 1,500 people. This is Ada. So Ada basically is a hedge fund that's actually run out of Hong Kong. So again, just a concept. We are getting to the point where we have a variety of different technologies that let us create autonomous companies that operate differently, maybe combine it with a robo-regulator. From a quantitative perspective as well, a couple of years ago we saw this, where Bloomberg published the wrong results for Facebook and it sent Facebook's stock down by $22 billion. So increasingly, what happens when you have creative AIs creating their own knowledge, creating autonomous organizations, perhaps in the financial services and investing space, what happens to the volatility of global markets in that particular environment? We already have people at the LSE that say, in the event something like this happens, there's no way to stop it. You start talking about global cascade effects. Similarly, we also are now at the point basically where, so I talked about data trust. We have machines copying people, mimicking people, replacing people, and building people. And this one, you might have seen this one before, and the reason I don't tend to sort of update this particular one is because there are so many.
The deadliest mass shooting in American history, and foremost in all of our minds, has been the loss and the grief felt by the people of Orlando. Especially our friends who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. I visited with the families of many of the victims on Thursday, and one thing I told them is that they're not alone. The American people and people all over the world are standing with them, and we always will. The investigation is ongoing, but we know that the killer was an angry and disturbed individual who took in extremist information and propaganda over the internet and became radicalized. During his killing spree, he pledged allegiance to ISIL, a group that's called on people around the world to attack innocent civilians. We are and we will keep doing everything in our power to stop these kinds of attacks and to ultimately destroy ISIL. The extraordinary people in our intelligence, military, homeland security, and law enforcement communities have already prevented many attacks, saved many lives, and we won't let up.
So here I'm setting the scene. The script for this advert was created by an AI. And AIs are doing basic movies by themselves. The person who filmed it, though, was a human. So over the space of just a couple of years, basically we've gone from nowhere, basically with things like deep fakes, fake news, and everything else, to the point where we're creating realistic videos, basically, that can fool most people. So while the data feeds that you're taking in might be from trusted data feed sources, the impact of the indirect sort of market basically can have an effect as well. However, the reason why I showed you those is because increasingly, remember at the start I said that technology lowers the bar? How many of you code? A couple. What would now happen if I started taking these powerful technologies and gave you access to them via any type of platform and just allowed you to type what you wanted to achieve? This is a year old now, basically it's from Stanford University, but you can literally say, create an advert of a man playing golf and drinking Coke, and it will go out, just like the Alexis ad, it will look at all the world's best adverts, the most highly awarded adverts and everything else, and it will start using its massive databases to start putting images together. So again, while you look at this and you sort of think, well, this is sort of fairly rubbish, you can still tell that's a golfer. This is completely synthetic data. If you are not paying attention to the rise of synthetic and fake data in your feeds, wherever your feeds are coming from, you could end up getting squished at some point, because this stuff is getting a lot better, a lot faster, and the technologies to try to identify this stuff are way behind, because it's only a recent problem, because we didn't see it coming. Although I did, but eventually. I want to show you now basically just an example of a robo-advisor. So this is Will. Now Will basically he's a digital teacher down in New Zealand, and he's already trained 250,000 kids.
I work at Vector helping young people learn about renewable energy. Here's what happened when I met some students for the first time. I can help you become an energy expert. What should we start with?
Geothermal genius.
Magma from the Earth's core comes closer to the surface and we end up with volcanoes, hot springs and geysers. But do you know what magma is?
Molten rock from the outer core.
Absolutely right.
I thought Will was really, fantastic.
Like he's there looking at us. It's like a real human.
Here's a quick question for you. What do you think is the windiest city in the world?
Wellington.
Nice. If the sun is so far away, how long do you think it takes sunlight to reach us?
10 minutes.
Correct. You're a solar superstar.
I was curious if they liked me.
It's different from talking to Will than talking to Siri, for example, because he's there, you can see him.
He was quite human-like, even though he's an AI.
Then, the human version of me arrived.
How's it going? Was it cool?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was cool. We got some really good reactions out of a few kids.
Is that good?
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah. A couple of them didn't recognise me straight away. You know it's me, eh?
Oh yeah, true, I can see that now.
It's a bit of a shock seeing my digital avatar for the first time. It's like looking in the mirror, I guess.
Let's face it, he may look like me, but I'm the one who knows about energy.
Yeah, I think Will could be used as an education tool in many areas.
We did learn some things that we didn't know.
Wellington is the windiest city.
I learned that you wouldn't notice if the sun went away for 10 minutes.
It's not just a blank screen they're staring at answering questions, so they feel like they're actually interacting with a human.
He was a good teacher.
It was great meeting the thinkers of tomorrow, because together we can shape our energy future.
So Will is not a scripted machine learning system, it's a neural network. So The answers that you saw in there basically were off its own bat. So again, this is where the technology was last year. This stuff accelerates. This stuff in 5 years' time, at the very least, will start looking a lot better basically in 5 years, even in a year's time, as high-definition rendering and computing basically improve. So these are sort of the new paradigms. Now, from a future skill sets perspective, this is sort of one of the biggest challenges that we have as society. So remember I said about the impact to you as individuals, you as organizations from an education and training perspective, but also your children. This stuff that I've shown you here, most of it didn't exist 5 years ago, but it's actually decent enough to fool people or to outperform people or whatever it happens to be. These are the soft skills that you need in the future. This is what we're increasingly embedding into the governments of Singapore, the UK, Germany, Middle East, all that sort of stuff. As well as basically some of the schools. You need to have an open mind. You need to think about the exponential angle. And then as we start looking a little bit more basically with this industry again, how many of you are already experimenting with quantum linear algorithms basically for your matrices? How many of you even have a point of view on quantum technology? There are already some large asset managers, for example, that are playing around basically with these algorithms. And this stuff will come through, in terms of a commercial product, this will come through 2020, 21, but really when you start hitting 2025, that's when you start getting to a decent-sized quantum computer that can really start turning industries on its head. Similarly, how many of you use supercomputers basically to train your hyperparameters? In the US, we are using Titan supercomputers, and Titan is now creating neural networks and hyperparameters 99% faster than humans. So typically, if you want to design a neural network, it takes an expert about 30 days. This thing's doing it in a day. Plus, Titan just got upgraded by Summit. Summit's 5 times faster. GPUs. If you're training your machine learning models and all that sort of stuff, you're probably using GPUs. Maybe a couple of other bits and bobs, but you might be using GPUs. Out of Bristol, we now have a company called GraphCore that let you train your machine learning models 100 times faster. But unlike using something like the NVIDIA CUDA programming language, this uses Ipsos. So if you want to train your ML models 100 times faster, how many of you are actually looking at intelligent processing units? This has been hailed by the founder of ARM as the future of AI from a computer chip perspective, and it's not really a computer chip, it's an organic hybrid thing. And then finally, if we want to create the first artificial general intelligences, you need AIs that reason. So increasingly, we are trying to get AIs to sort of think outside the box. This is where creativity, imagination, and all these other bits and bobs come in. So we get there. As I said, all of this is then a precursor to AGI, and Google DeepMind last year released the Impala framework, which you can go and have a look at. It allows you to do 30 different parameters at once. So it's a very basic AGI, but this thing, the first kind of generation 0.1 AGI was supposed to appear in 2030, 2035. There are still lots of hurdles to go through with these things. It's a journey. It's not a sprint, but we're still getting there. So this stuff is arriving faster than we think. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, when you think about artificial intelligence and the impact that it has on your businesses or the things that you are interested in, whether it's other industries or products or services or what have you, increasingly, basically, these wet AIs are starting to come through, particularly over in the US. These are revolutionary from a healthcare perspective. These things will let you turn a human eventually into, well, we've already done it now, but eventually when they go through regulators, these will eventually turn your body basically into a disease-fighting supercomputer where you have customizable DNA that identifies disease as it travels throughout your body, it detects biomarkers, and then it creates a drug to go off and kill it and combat it. But as for me, basically, that concludes my presentation. If you want to have a look at some of the material basically in here, you can go to my website, 311institute.com/explore. And thank you very much for listening. I hope you have a great rest of the day.